Let's talk for a moment about Frankenstein. And no, I do not mean the classic Universal Studios version of Frankenstein, but I mean the brilliant old piece of sci-fi written by Mary Shelley. And I've talked about this book before, so this isn't going to be a book review because I've reviewed this in the past, but this book has just been on my mind a lot in the past couple of months, mainly because there is an adaptation of Frankenstein that comes out actually quite soon on Netflix, although I've seen it in the movie theater, and it's why I'm excited to make this.
I had a vision. An idea took shape in my mind. Inevitable. Unavoidable. Until it became truth.
And also because there are interesting themes that I appreciate much more actually now than I think I did even when I first read it. And I think I want to explore those themes in four, you could say, different bullet points because these are themes that I think are overlooked, or at least aspects of them are definitely overlooked. And I think that's worthy of a discussion, especially maybe before you go see that movie, because the new movie I think is quite faithful to the book. Although they make some changes, it's something that is bound to happen. Like, for example, the same thing happened with Game of Thrones. Like when the people adapted the stories onto book format or onto, you could say, series format, not everything kind of corresponded one to one, and it's fine. So I think the key essence though is still in there, and I really want to talk about it. So before jumping into those overlooked themes, I think I should just give a general view of things, and that is that maybe if you clicked on this video, you already know what the story of Frankenstein is about, and it is very roughly speaking about the scientist who is obsessed with conquering death and ends up creating life that is made from various different pieces, basically, to leave out the gory details, and actually not understanding what to do after he created life. It is a classic tale of human, you could say, ambition, ego, and also just thinking about the moral implications of what it means to create. Something that is very relevant, especially among scientists and people that are working in technology or engineering. Like it prompts you to think about ethics, basically. And I think that's a big cornerstone of this story, as well as some of the societal implications, which I think there are better people on BookTube to talk about that than I would. So I want to now emphasize from those general themes the four different things that I think are quite fascinating about this book. So aside from, for example, the reasoning why Mary Shelley herself wrote this book, which came more from a place, I think, of grief, that I think she lost her child, and because of that, wanted to play with the thought of what it would mean to kind of recreate life. The main idea of this book is the idea of creation. So that, as I said before, is something that people have quite mentioned a lot, but really I think is quite fascinating because the act of creating is as fascinating as what happens afterwards, which I think I will talk about in the third bullet point. The act of creation is seen in many mythical stories as one of the few connections that humanity has to the divine, to whatever that may be. That is because creating something in many cultural narratives is seen as the ultimate, you could say, accomplishment of like that a human body, for example, could do. And what is of course fascinating about this is that Victor Frankenstein is circumventing the natural way of doing such creation by doing something that is completely artificial and completely kind of baked up by, you could say, unknown knowledge. And I think that is the theme that Mary Shelley was going for. The subtitle of this book originally was A Modern Prometheus because it borrows from the Promethean narrative of the same deity that stole fire from the gods and brought it down to humanity because of his sympathy for humanity. Prior to when Prometheus gave fire to humans, humanity were seen just as another species, but because Prometheus has a lot of sympathy for humans, he stole the fire to give humans kind of the means and autonomy to develop into somewhat of a kind of moral competition against the gods. So this act of defiance led Prometheus to be quite severely punished, and the book brilliantly explores what said punishment looked like in this case for the creator, which is Victor Frankenstein. And I think that is of course a fascinating aspect because in the case of the Prometheus story, Prometheus was punished by kind of being tied to rocks and have his one of his organs basically eaten out by an animal consistently and endlessly because the organ could regrow. So he would be in this eternal cycle of torment. And in a very similar way, Victor Frankenstein also experienced extreme torment by his ultimate act of defiance basically against natural order. The second overlooked theme that I wanted to talk about is actually some of the scientific backdrop that kind of looms in the background when you're reading this book or when you go to watch the new movie. And that is because Mary Shelley actually had a bit of scientific literacy as she wrote the book. She herself was not a scientist, but she grew around families who were friends with natural philosophers, which was the word you used for scientists back then. And she would hear about debates and things that are of relevance at the time. And she even, some would say, I think, went to certain lectures in the Royal Institution that kind of covered some of these things that were quite daunting and controversial at the time, particularly something known as galvanism, the use of electrochemical reactions to kind of reanimate, in a way, tissue. A famous example of this is where apparently it seemed like for a brief moment people could reanimate dead frogs, particularly when you see this portrait of how a conductor is placed between the spinal cord of a frog and one of its legs. And because this forms a close current and actually legs and muscle tissues have ions that flow, that kind of causes a current to pass, which allows the muscle to contract, and that kind of makes basically the legs twitch, even though the frog is long dead. It is something that, of course, scared people because it's a very morbid sight to see, like something like this. But also, it prompted another scientific discussion, which I think is not often mentioned, but I did notice in this new adaptation of the movie, and I was greatly appreciative of it because it is also just very, very, very subtly hinted in the original novel as well. And that is this debate around vitalism and materialism. This is a debate that especially a life scientist had at the time, and that is that what makes up life? Like, what makes life, and is it unique? And that is the thing that makes something alive some type of vital energy or some type of essence, basically, that is very unique to life, or can all of it be explained by just the material world? And for the longest of time, especially in the early 19th century, people really thought that vitalism, that this belief of there being some sort of vital force around life, that is the thing that is merit of studying when it comes to tackling questions about life. And an example of this would be the Chinese medicine version of this, which is qi, a notion of an energy flow throughout the body that flows between the acupuncture points of the body that especially connect to the meridians, which is some particular energy source, very similar to the concept of chakras, but somewhat different. And I think this is quite fascinating because it does have some loose connections with what the anatomical structure of our actually body is like, but also it kind of segues into how people nowadays think about biology, and that is that slowly, even in the 19th century, people were able to start synthesizing simple organic compounds. For example, people were first able to synthesize urea. Urea being, as you can kind of hear in the name, the one of the major chemical compounds that you find in urine, and people didn't think for the longest of time that natural reactions could produce this, that only living organisms, and especially, of course, the kidneys, are able to produce urine. But after this particular chemist showed that this is possible, it kind of made people wonder to what extent they should think about this vitalism theory. And later, larger chemical compounds, sugars, and whatnot were also being able to be synthesized. And even though vitalism gained a little bit of traction in the middle of the 19th century with the biochemist Louis Pasteur, which is one of the most famous biochemists if you read a bit about the history of science, he showed the pasteurization procedure, which is extremely important nowadays still for preserving certain food. He showed that this fermentation in these reactions that happen, they can only happen because of bacteria and the necessity of these bacteria with their enzymes to catalyze these reactions. Yet eventually, much later, people did find that even these enzymes and even these chemicals that are being used in these reactions are things that are completely devoid of needing life, that with the right conditions, you can still recreate the same reactions. So I think there's a very interesting scientific undertone there between the discussion of vitalism, that you need some essence in order for life to be truly fundamental, or materialism, that you can truly do so completely independent of whatever this underlying thing could be. And in the book, for example, this is mentioned because what kind of motivates Victor Frankenstein to kind of do his creation is that he discovers this so-called spark of life. Mary Shelley keeps it extremely vague as to what this is, of course, but I do like to think that this is kind of getting a lot into this idea of vitalism, that maybe Frankenstein discovered what this vital substance actually is and was able to use that for his experiments. Because even the creation of the creature in the book is something that is a bit different than, for example, how movies, even the new one, portrays it. It doesn't include all the fancy electricity, sparks and whatnot. It is just a purely chemical thing that happens. So I'll leave that for you to discover yourself if you ever read the book, but you'll find that slight difference, I think, quite fascinating once you know a little bit of the historical scientific backdrop that all of this took place in. Now, the third overlooked point that I wanted to mention is of the creature itself being intelligent. And this, I think, again, is one of the places where the book commonly kind of heavily detours away from how movie adaptations portrayed Frankenstein's creation, because it is typically portrayed as something that is either soulless or that isn't, you could say, fully consciousness, that is somewhat different from what makes someone human. And in the book, the point that Mary Shelley tries to show is that the creature is very human, actually, that the creature imprints on the people that the creature has seen for his whole life, basically. It is grown onto Earth not as a baby, but as already in a grown body. But mentally, the creature is experiencing everything that a newborn person would experience. Like complete confusion, does not know what is going on, is helpless, and tries to, in essence, understand its surroundings, basically, by the people around him, by the things that he sees around him, by the emotions expressed. And particularly, this is explored in the original story, as well as certain adaptations, in how the creature goes to this family, at least looks at them from a distance, and tries to learn about what humanity is like through observing this family. And I think that is extremely fascinating because it shows the layers of depth of emotions and empathy that the creature is actually capable of, because at the end of the day, what Victor created was actually pretty much close to being human, or one would even say that it is like a human. And I think this awareness that the creature has, especially the emotions that it feels, even though it might not always be able to articulate it in the beginning quite well, is really beautifully captured when it is shown kindness, and especially when the creature is provided with literature to read, and the literature that actually grabs the creature attention, which is actually a book that I physically have, and that is Paradise Lost by John Milton, a very classic, beautiful piece of poetry that is telling the story about Genesis from the perspective of Lucifer. So it's trying to kind of show the full process of creation, of how God, according to the biblical story, created the earth, as well as some of the complexity behind how God's favorite angel, Lucifer, viewed this act of creation and how he slowly rebelled. It is basically, if I were to phrase this in modern story terms, it is kind of telling a very complex, interesting villain story where the villain in this case is, well, Lucifer. So it is quite interesting. I think people that are very religious might kind of find doubts with this book, though, because I don't think it is the easiest thing to digest, maybe. But it is incredibly fascinating. And I think a quote from this particular book that came from Adam in book 10, which I should mention, this poetry is kind of separated into books, not chapters. In book 10, when Adam eventually is brought into the story of Genesis and kicked out of the Garden of Eden after Eve and the serpent tempted him to eat the fruit, you get this really beautiful quote that Adam mentions in this story that I will just read to you. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me, or here place in this delicious garden? As my will concurred not to my being, it were but right and equal to reduce me to my dust. And as I think you could see for yourself, that quote is highly reminiscent for how the creature feels in the story, and also how it eventually reacted to its circumstances in the pursuit of its maker. So that sympathy, intelligence, and empathetic beat of the creature is something that I do think people do mention quite enough, which is good. But I did still want to emphasize, because especially if you're more used to maybe the monster flick version of Frankenstein, you might be perhaps a little bit shocked when you see, for example, this new movie adaptation that actually does lean heavily into that more interesting, complex aspect of the creature. It is a very beautiful, haunting piece of the story. And now for the final overlooked point that I really wanted to talk about, because this is one that I really do not think I've seen in any, you could say, analysis of the story, and that is the ambition of young Frankenstein. The reason I want to mention this is that usually you hear the quote that, well, wisdom is knowing that Victor Frankenstein is the real monster and not its creation. And yes, this is pretty much true. And I think, especially in the book, this is shown in a very subtle way. But what I do also think is that Mary Shelley made a character that is a bit more complex than that. And that is that Victor's ambition and curiosity, aside from recognition and ego, comes from an extremely human place to create something in the hopes, much like Prometheus, to further mankind in ways that mankind could never have been able to before. In this case, conquering death. It comes from a very noble place, and it also comes from a very human place, because Victor Frankenstein suffered a tragedy in his life. He lost his mother at a very young age, so this is something that makes him almost obsessed with wanting to figure out this secret to immortality and to eternal life. I find this to be incredibly fascinating because, especially maybe if you've read biographies of other scientists, or if you yourself are a scientist in training, there are bits of his characteristics and ambition that, much like a double-edged sword, where one edge of the sword can be very troublesome and can lead you to make hubris decision, the other edge of the sword, which is the ambition, is highly relatable. And that is that aspect from the book which I really like, where it tells the story of how he was a young student, spent late nights studying, poured through anatomy books, and went to the most remote places to learn about aspects of medicine and aspects of science that were not, you could say, well understood in the West, or that were even forbidden. Kind of hinting basically that he partook in things like occultism and alchemy. This scientific drive is not even something that is remote from real life. I think a really good example of this is actually the mathematician slash physicist slash theologian Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, who is very well known for his law of gravitation, is actually someone that was driven by a very similar, you could say, ambition, in his case, to understand the full complexity of the natural world. And he thought that, well, with mathematics, one could get somewhat close to that, but that the other side of the coin is that one would need to explore the link between the spiritual and the earthly, and that came through, for example, alchemy and his religious studies. So this is why actually Isaac Newton was actually obsessed with alchemy and also even with theological studies, because he really wanted to understand the world in its full spectrum at whatever cost it may be. And it is very similar to what Frankenstein does here. What I want to say with this rant is that Victor Frankenstein, even though people often, of course, know him to be the monster because what he did after the creation, I think prior to the creation, his drive for actually pushing the boundaries of human knowledge is something that is extremely relatable. I do think that if he had checked that ambition with actual ethical thinking, reflectivity, and a bit of moral awareness, then he might have made better decisions post that creation. So yeah, this is why I think there are aspects of Victor Frankenstein's characters that I quite personally relate with, even though, of course, the ultimate result of his action is completely monstrous, but the motivation is something I deeply relate with, and even the way he went about the pursuit, which is in the book a very lonely pursuit, like very isolated, very driven. Yeah, these are all things I personally really relate with. So yeah. So I think that marks the end of my ramblings about Frankenstein. As you can see, I really love the story, and I'm in the process currently of rereading it. It doesn't mean I think that I will review the book again, because I've already said what I have to say about it, even though, as you can see, my thoughts changed over time. But I'm just reading it for my own sake because I really love this story. It's a quick read too, as you can see right here. And yeah, I just want to explore these classics a little bit. Perhaps if one day I do read Paradise Lost back to back, I may actually kind of review that for you, or just talk about poetry in general, because on the more fictional or less, you could say, science-y or biography side of my readings, I've been quite enjoying poetry the last couple of months, and I would like to maybe make a dedicated video on poetry itself, or maybe on a particular poetry book that I've read. So perhaps I might do something like this. And again, I'd really be curious to hear your thoughts on any of these 4 points that I mentioned, because though I think some of these points have been brought up in like past analyses of Frankenstein, Frankenstein, I do think the exploration of them, the elements of them, has been quite lost because of course, movie incarnations of the story of Frankenstein. So I'd love to hear what you have down below, and I really hope to see you all quite soon again. Bye bye.